today. So we're really excited to get started, but before we do, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. So right now, everyone is on mute just to avoid any background noises that may distract you from listening to the webinar, but we do, of course, want to encourage active participation. So if you have a question, just type it into the question box at the bottom right-hand side of your webinar screen. We will monitor the questions as they come in, and we'll answer as many of them as possible at the end of the webinar. We'll also be live tweeting throughout the webinar, so feel free to join in the conversation online by following us at Analyst8. I know we want to get right into the meat of this presentation, but I just want to quickly introduce our speaker today, Tony Gallagher. So Tony is a senior consultant at Analyst8. You can see his picture up there on the screen. He works with clients across multiple verticals and industries and specializes in data visualization, data modeling, solution architecture, and support. And just one quick word about our company. I see some customers and names I recognize on the webinar, but for those of you who don't know who we are, Analyst8 is a data and analytics consulting company. And one thing that we're really passionate about is how to effectively communicate the meaning of your data. Developing dashboards that users can actually make decisions from is obviously key to seeing ROI from your analytics efforts. We know there are a lot of tips out there, and it can be hard to know which ones to utilize. So during our webinar today, Tony's really going to break that down for you. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Tony.
Thanks, Tracy. So whether you're a business leader, a strategist in your organization, an analyst, or developer, data matters to you now more than ever. And my goal today is to convince you that how you visualize your data is key to unlocking and unleashing its full potential. So we'll discuss the answer to these questions on this first slide today. Note that any and all the resources I reference will be provided to you to further your learning after the webinar. So we'll begin with a simple question. Why is data visualization important? Well, one answer is surprisingly simple. Humans are really good at understanding data when it's visualized properly. We can process large amounts of information and determine what is most important. We can categorize and group, identify trends, and eliminate noise with our brains without much effort when we use our visual system to interpret data, as opposed to our verbal system, which is to read data. When used correctly, data visualization can actually reduce the time it takes to process information. Because of this, it is our responsibility as data visualizers and communicators to minimize the work required of our audience. Ask, how hard am I making people work to understand this information? Another word for this is cognitive lift. So anyone visualizing data should obsess over how to minimize this burden on their audience at all costs. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this webinar, it's that this goal should be your main purpose when visualizing data. You should obsess over how to minimize cognitive lift for your audience at all costs. And there's one more takeaway that we'll get to later, but I want to focus on this one first. So in her book, Storytelling with Data, Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflic argues that, quote, every single element that we put on a page takes up cognitive load on the part of our audience, end quote. This lift requires time and effort, especially when it comes to understanding data. But there are systematic and objective ways we can minimize the stress we put on our audience by using what are called pre-attentive attributes, which are what our brain does behind the scenes when we first see a visualization. She focuses on 6 attributes, and we'll talk about those now. So I'll give you a moment to interpret these visualizations. Did you notice how the same data is actually repeated 5 times here, but visualized differently? Even still, your brain interpreted the data 5 different ways without much thought, though. This is an example of how our pre-attentive attributes work. We can use these powerful tools to bring attention to what we think is most important in our data. Our brains not only interpret relationships, but it can prioritize them as well. Did you notice how you interpreted the connectedness of the dots as a higher priority attribute than their proximity to one another? Effective understanding and use of these attributes is key, since unintended relationships result when they're used inappropriately. You don't want to communicate relationships that don't exist. because you incur a cost and cognitive load with your audience to make them undo those relationships that are inferred. Stephen Few in his book, Now You See It, actually goes a step further and describes how our pre-attentive attributes can help interpret not only relationships in data, but also quantitative values of the data a visualization represents, though these representations actually carry varying degrees of precision. So, for example, we intuitively interpret longer lines as being greater than shorter lines, and dot position up and to the right as being greater than those down and to the left. You can see that in that blue box there. He argues that our brains are very precise at interpreting these two types of attributes, but we're not very precise when interpreting the other four attributes shown here on the right. So how wide something is, how large something is, how intense, and how blurry those objects are. Greater precision actually decreases cognitive lift, so it's easier to interpret how much longer something is and how much wider something is, and we need to keep that in mind when we visualize data. We want to make it easier for our audience at all costs. And two more final pre-attentive attributes that she covers in her book Storytelling with Data here that minimize cognitive lift are closure and continuity. So these two emphasize how our brain actually completes the picture. We experience a complete circle and a y-axis on this bar chart, though neither actually exist visually here. We can use these attributes for our main purpose stated earlier, to eliminate clutter and reduce cognitive load in our visualizations. There's no need to include the lines to complete the circle or the axis on the bar chart if our audience brains are actually going to provide them for us. So here's a tip. Before presenting data to your audience, ask yourself, how can I decrease cognitive lift required by my audience? Or another way of putting that, are pre-attentive attributes working for me or against me on my visualizations? Can I take out the trash in my presentation or on my dashboard and utilize pre-attentive attributes of my audience to eliminate clutter? Speaking of reducing cognitive load, dulling the background on a PowerPoint slide can actually help decrease the work your brain had to do to focus on the text here. So another thing to keep in mind there with that. A different answer to the question of why data visualization is important is equally relevant, though. That's because data is a numeric or textual representation of the facts. Because data visualizations are one level removed from data as representations of the data themselves, visualizations can remind people, albeit subconsciously, that the data itself is just a representation of people, places, and things. We could visualize data in many different ways, and that may lead us to different conclusions. And similarly, new data sets will provide new contexts that may lead us to different conclusions as well. So understanding that our data has a story behind it should help us figure out the best way to craft a visualization to represent our data. Like any good story, context matters. And Nathan Yao in his book, Data Points, says that, quote, without context, data is useless, and any visuals you create with it will be useless, end quote. So knowing the story behind your data will actually help you determine how to explain the story in your data. Yao encourages us in Data Points to ask who collected the data, and how did they collect it, and why did they collect it? Since this will tell us the reliability of the data, any potential biases in the data, and expose any ethical concerns in the data. Ask yourself, based on the nature of my data, what can I reliably put emphasis on? What are valid conclusions, and what are invalid conclusions someone could draw from this data? And if a visualization has a risk of misleading someone, exposing someone, or purposefully harming someone, how should I present the information? You should think twice how you visualize and communicate that information. An example he uses to demonstrate this principle is by visualizing data from the 2010 Gawker password breach, where they de-encrypted passwords from the site for the users for Gawker. He says, quote, the main thing to do would be to highlight usernames with common or poor passwords, or create an application that actually guesses passwords. And he proposes visualizing the common passwords from the breach to help serve as a warning to users to make their passwords less obvious and actually provides context for why passwords appeared frequently to help draw conclusions. So one of the analyses that he adds to this visualization is that people tended to use the names of the Gawker subsites like Lifehacker, Gizmodo as their passwords. So this visualization helps draw attention to the fact that people need to think twice before using those types of passwords without necessarily exposing particular users that use those passwords. I like the quote he provides that quote, data is an abstraction of real life, and real life can be complicated, but if you gather enough context, you can at least put forth a solid effort to make sense of it, end quote. So data visualization and communication can have a positive or negative effect, but either way, the effect can be powerful because of the information that data conveys. So that's why it's important how we approach visualization with the intent. Also, you should stop using password as your password. It's another good takeaway. This leads us to our next question. How do I communicate the story in my data? Well, what's your purpose? Not all data visualizations are intended to produce the same type of aha moment in your audience. Understand that guidelines or rules are meant to help you communicate with your audience, but your intention or purpose of visualizing data will dictate whether or not those guidelines are worth following to communicate your story at all. If your goal is to make beautiful art with data visualizations, then the aha moment in your story is, look how beautiful this is, not as much about the conclusions you can draw from the information itself. On the other hand, you should approach your work differently if you're trying to nail your quarterly PowerPoint presentation to a board of directors. If you're trying to discover what's important in your data, you will have a different purpose in storytelling than if you're trying to persuade others of what you already know to be important. Again, in storytelling with data, Nussbaumer-Knaflic delineates between these two purposes as exploratory versus explanatory analysis. She says, quote, exploratory analysis is what you do to figure out what is noteworthy. Explanatory is when you have a specific thing you want to explain, end quote. So we'll start with some exploratory principles here. There's lots of ways to do this, especially depending on the tool that you're using. Generally, though, I propose a more systematic approach regardless of your data tool of choice. So while it's not a perfect approach, it's a great way to familiarize your audience with your data, especially if you have the capabilities to expose data to them in a governed or data discovery environment for exploration. So in other words, just a dashboard or a platform. Dashboards can be good ways to put guardrails on users' data exploration while it's still enabling them to find meaningful information. So the exploratory design principles I generally start with are to 1, start with a summary, 2, allow for discovery with as much context and interactivity as possible, so that allows users to be curious, and 3, verify with the details by providing the actual data that supports those visualizations. There's lots of catchy ways to say this, and feel free to come up with your own snazzy alliterations. Summary, discovery, details, or display, diagnose, decide. There's lots. But along with being a very logical approach to visualization, it also can greatly reduce performance impact on analytic systems, since you should reduce the amount of data people are returning in their queries at any given time, because people start with summaries, and as they filter and drill down, they would expose more data, but limit it with their queries. So dual benefit there. A great book I recommend for learning more about exploratory analysis is Signal by Stephen Few. He talks a lot about how the volumes and volumes of data that we're generating require us to become adept at finding what is important. So there's lots of good stuff in that book, and I encourage you to check that out if you're looking for techniques and tips to understand what matters in your data and how to find that. For explanatory analysis, on the other hand, to know how you should communicate, you should start with what you need to communicate. This is where people come into the picture. Ultimately, any data we have is lacking context to some degree, even in the age of information, and human intuition is invaluable to identify this gap of information. The trick is to challenge and confirm our intuitions. Another way I've heard this put is to trust but verify. We can use all sorts of analytics tools on the marketplace today to help our audience discover what's most important in their data, But the secret sauce in your data is what you and your audience bring to the table. When you combine intuition with data, decision-making flourishes. Storytelling with data gives these helpful questions to ask before you attempt to persuade someone with data. Who are you communicating with? And do they trust you? What bias does my audience have? Will this make them supportive or resistant to my message? And what do I want my audience to know or do? And be willing to ask for an action. We'll go through an example of explanatory analysis. So I love the NBA, and I think ESPN does a great job of communicating what happened in a game using data visualizations that follow these guidelines to some degree. Ultimately, the story might be different from game to game, but the visualizations on their site, when organized, can give an audience a pretty good idea of the story arc of the game without having to watch any highlights or anything like that. And it helps people figure out what drove the outcome of the game. So let's start with the way not to do it. So it's really common to see tables and PowerPoint slides, in my experience. Imagine you're trying to figure out what happened in the game last night. You're looking at the box score as kind of a starting point. So from this, you can tell who won, who contributed the most in terms of points. And you can see all the key metrics here, or many of the key metrics. And you get an idea for what was most important, potentially. But this forces people to read the data, to use their verbal system instead of their visual system, which can be tedious. So what if we tried to communicate the game story using visuals or a dashboard instead? What would that look like? So now what is most important is now front and center. We know that Golden State won the game. The most important visualization is put in the top left, the score. The next visualization tells the story arc of the game with the game flow chart. Side note, that game flow chart can be very useful in the business world when you're talking about actuals versus budget and how you pace towards those, or if you have some kind of goal, because it shows, just like in basketball, it shows when the game turned or when the situation turned, when you went on a hot streak and when you were unable to score. So it's useful more than just basketball. The rest of the charts represent metrics for win probability, shot distribution, and the key metrics comparisons there in the bottom right. But notice that we're focusing on what I think is most important. And I'm not letting you pick and choose metrics from a big table, because my purpose is to explain to you what happened, not leave much room for further exploration on info like usage rate or efficiency, even though those could be interesting explorations. I'm dictating the why with how I'm visualizing data and how I'm laying it out. In Western language, we're trained to read things left to right and top to bottom. So for the attention that your eyes gave this slide, your data visualization should take advantage of this by ordering your visualizations by their importance in this way. So I put the ESPN logo at the top right to convey to you that I did not make these visuals, and that the information is important for me to convey in that way. But it's not as important as who won the game. So even though there's a logo at the top on this, generally speaking, I would recommend not putting logos, because that's at the top of your PowerPoint slides or your dashboards, because it's very valuable real estate when it comes to your audience's attention. So it's a good question to ask before you do that. Lastly, Nussbaum and Affleck in her book Storytelling with Data suggests that you summarize when your purpose is explanatory, to visualize to persuade. So she puts it this way, quote, "If you had a single sentence to tell your audience what they need to know, what would you say?" End quote. And then put it on your slide, right? You want to persuade people. So I'm trying to persuade you that Golden State won the game due to a dominating second half, especially in the clutch. And we can see that from the visualizations provided here. Then include the raw data tables at the back of your PowerPoint deck in an appendix for later reference. So you don't have to completely abandon them, but I would avoid putting all the information in front of your users instead of trying to focus on what's most important when your purpose is to explain. Let's dive deeper into the data visualizations themselves now. So the question to ask here is there a way to determine effectiveness of data visualizations? Or is it merely subjective opinion for which charts are better than others? It's kind of a timeless question for data viz. Well, I think we need to frame the debate here first, though. So effectiveness depends on the purpose of our visualizations, again, as we discussed. Since we marketed this webinar to business people and not art students, though, I think it's a fair assumption to make that we're dealing with business people on this webinar generally. So my purpose in this webinar and generally is to help your organization translate your data into meaningful and actionable information. A great way to do this and to measure the effectiveness of your visualizations is to understand the cognitive load we place on our audience and to know how to focus attention on what's important. And I would even go as far to say to test that with people. So you can put different examples in front of people and see which things they understand more quickly. So we're going to do that. So let's go rapid fire through some examples. Classic one here, pie chart versus bar chart. Which chart do you think is easier to interpret quickly for exploratory analysis? Simply put, I think our brains are better at seeing which values are greater than others in a simple bar chart versus a pie chart. If our goal is to reduce cognitive lift, then bar charts will win the battle of effectiveness every time, just based on the way that our brains process information, even if they're not as visually stimulating to look at. How about this one? Which chart do you think is clearer for explanatory analysis? If you were to present this information to your audience, the chart on the left would, in my opinion, leave no question which category you're planning to discuss. It's the blue bar. While the chart on the right is noisy because of all the color. You don't know what's the most important thing. It's important that we use color to draw attention to and emphasize what we think is most important, while still leaving context to the whole. And that goes for explanatory and exploratory analysis, I would argue. How about these two visualizations here? I would argue it depends. So by connecting the dots or not connecting the dots, you're going to take advantage of different pre-attentive attributes of your audience. The scatter plot in the top left would take advantage of proximity to define the relationship in the data by clustering, so which dots are closest together as being important. While the bottom right chart would use connectedness as the pre-attentive attribute to draw attention to the progression of information from left to right. And that's why it's important that we need to know what pre-attentive attributes are working for us and against us. And we need to choose the right ones to convey the relationships in our data. We don't want to make our users have to think harder to undo a relationship we created by connecting the dots or not connecting the dots. But either way, don't choose scatter plots versus line charts flippantly. Do it with a purpose. Connect the dots with a purpose or leave them unconnected with a purpose. All right. Which value do you think is most important in these two visualizations? I think it depends, but we can use sorting to order visualizations by their values and not their alphabetical name to make it easier to read either way, whatever value we're trying to focus on. And I take it a step farther than that. We can combine principles to actually maximize the effect and focus attention, right? So if my goal is to call attention to E being the lowest value, then the bottom right chart is going to be the best way to accomplish that, with also providing context to the other values too. So I would argue to use color and sorting in that way. But again, the point here is to be intentional. While we're on this bar chart example, remember that you should include labels in your charts, either on the axis or on the actual bars themselves, especially in dashboard tools, because it's a pain to have your audience hover on each value to determine scale. And I guess that goes even more so for PowerPoint slides because they don't have the ability to even hover. Like I said, you can trade axis lines for individual display values on the bars. If you show the display values on the bars, get rid of the axis because otherwise you're just cluttering your visualization. But ultimately, your goal for this design is really acceptable options. It just kind of depends. But again, be intentional with your choice and get rid of the clutter. Don't do both here. So bar charts are fine, but you don't think I'd just show bar charts in a data viz webinar, or at least I would hope that you guys wouldn't want me to do that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of chart variety. Frankly, I think I see too much variety just for the sake of variety in data visualizations today that I'm exposed to. We can get really exotic when it comes to presenting information and provide a ton of value in doing so. Majority of the time, though, most organizations will use these 12 visualizations to actually communicate their data. And this list is according to Knaflic in Storytelling with Data. These are her top 12. I would eliminate square area in the bottom right here from my top 12, though, because I think the problem with the square area chart is how do you know if the blue represents 25% of the data or just 20% of the data? In other words, like, do the gray boxes extend behind the blue area, or are they separate from the blue area altogether? Our pre-attentive attribute of continuance might be working against us here. So I would avoid square area charts for that purpose, and I'd replace them with maps instead. But in terms of visualizations, you kind of can do a health check on your presentations and on your dashboards to make sure you're keeping a steady diet of these types of charts when presenting information to people, because they're the most efficient. You can consider them your fruits and veggies contrasted with dessert visualizations like pie charts, which those hold aesthetic value, and there's value in that, but ultimately they're going to fall short in terms of solid analytic value in terms of efficiency. And they might end up making your audience work harder to understand the information you're trying to present. And again, choosing these 12, within these 12, knowing when to show the data in a table versus a heat map or a line chart versus a scatter plot is going to depend on your visualization. But it's good to ask, like, am I reading the data, or am I allowing the visuals to help me interpret the information first before I give the users the ability to use the data? But ultimately, kind of like the tip says, make sure your people are eating their fruits and veggies and not just consuming dessert with pie charts. So normally this is the point in the presentation where the data viz expert will get up on their soapbox and trash pie charts and alternative viz elements and tell you how any presentation with a pie chart will make them lose their respect and attention for the presenter. But this is not that presentation. I want to focus now on the topic of adoption. So for those of you who don't know, adoption means that people are actually going to use this information or buy into the way that we're communicating it. So, for dashboards, it means I'm using the dashboards. For PowerPoint deck, it means that I'm going to take that information and do an action with it. So the point here is that when we talk about adoption, aesthetics matter. Visualizations referred to as chart junk, as I've heard, those matter. They just do. People get really excited when they get to use a new visualization type to discover hidden information in their data, no matter how superficial it is. Ultimately, the value of the information you provide is whether or not people actually consume it and whether or not they actually do anything about it once they see it. So any way you can drive adoption, do so with a clear conscience, even if that means throwing in a pie chart every once in a while. But do so intentionally as a concession because your audience loves pie charts. Don't do that flippantly. Just remember to give them a steady diet of their fruits and veggie visualizations, our top 12 that we talked about, versus just giving them dessert. But in the name of adoption, we're going to get a little more exotic here and talk about some alternative ways to visualize your data that I've seen out in the business world being effective. So we're going to ease our way in here with a couple here that are less controversial. But one important addition I'd make to the geomapping as a visualization type is mapping non-traditional geographic areas like buildings, warehouses, retail floors, etc., to unlock hidden relationships in your data that wouldn't necessarily be seen from like a bar chart or a scatter plot. These are just sports examples from ESPN and StubHub, but I think there are plenty of good examples from the business world that we could discuss as well. If you have questions about that. Another one here, Pareto charts, or cumulative percent of total charts. Again, this can help your audience focus on what's most important by showing percent of total here. And I would add color to highlight that the data above, the cumulative result of 80% is most important, to focus the attention on the categories that are actually driving results in your business. One caveat in what I've seen before is just careful not to use negative values in these charts, because it leads to odd behavior of cumulative sums over 100%, and it can be really confusing. But I like this chart because it adds a light flare to the standard bar chart, and it won't exclude people from being able to derive information from it, even if they aren't trained in what a Pareto is or how to read it. They're still going to get some value out of it, while those who are trained in it will get even more value out of the chart type. So this is a good one. All right, a little more interesting now. So this is a radar chart. I think these are an underutilized way to compare multiple different categories against multiple different metrics. So one example of this for HR would be measuring like how well-rounded an employee is based on like their skill assessment data. So with a radar chart, the representationness of the well-roundedness of your employees is quite literal, since the more shaded area an employee shows in the radar chart, the more well-rounded they are in their skills that you're measuring. And this can also be used to identify skill gaps when you're comparing multiple employees, because you can quickly see if one area of the web is lacking across multiple folks, as long as they're all sorted in the right order. So the same principles will apply here as our pre-attentive attributes, but it's just a different way to kind of visualize the information shown here to show well-roundedness of folks. And you could imagine doing this for your customers as well, with, their, your service level scores or profitability, revenue, costs, et cetera. It's a good way to compare things together when you're looking at multiple metrics. I don't see this one enough, I think. So this is a box and whisker charts. They're good ways to identify the distribution of data. So it's a great way to see outliers, to see what the mean is, what the median is, and then how your data is distributed like among the quartiles. But this is a tougher chart for non-technical people to understand and interpret. But again, I think it provides a wealth of information in a concise, clear way. So again, though, I would use this one only when training or explanations are provided with your audience to kind of help them not infer things that aren't being shown here. But this data is showing, the data from our fantasy baseball draft, and showing, which teams' player values were, how they were distributed. So kind of fun for baseball fans out there. A great place to go for inspiration on even more out-of-the-box visualizations would be d3js.org, and they have a wiki gallery on GitHub as well. So I would check that out. But we're going to run through a couple examples on those sites that I singled out that I think would be valuable still in the business world. What's cool about these, most of these are very colorful and interactive, so they can serve the dual purpose of art and exploration or explanation, depending on the charts that you're choosing here. So we'll go through a few of these examples now. The first one here is a calendar visual. So a heat map put onto a calendar over multiple years. So you can see the black lines will delineate between months. Each of the rows then would be distributed for what day of the week we're looking at. So this can be a great way to look at seasonality in your data. This one's by a guy named Mike Bostock and blocks.org. And this will help us see like week over week trends, month over month trends, and year over year changes in our data in a really organized way that's visually appealing too. But again, you got to be careful, because it forces people to hover on this to be precise with how they're actually interpreting the data. But this is a good starting point for getting a high-level view of what your data holds. Taken to kind of an extreme level, you can look at time series analysis in this way too. So like this would be a similar chart, but we're looking at it at an hourly level. So as the x-axis progresses here, we're looking at a minute-by-minute basis, and this could potentially be like, different manufacturing lines. It could be days of the month, be all sorts of different stuff. We're trying to show here is, again, like looking at analyzing foot traffic in a retail store or downtime in an industrial warehouse. You're not going to get very precise, again, but you're trying to get a feel for what's happening at a given time in your data. So, for IoT data, when you're looking at a ton of data and trying to get a summary view, this can be helpful. I still think it's at least this particular view is a lot of noise. Definitely not precise, but it's fun to look at. So there's something for that. But a similar, simpler version of the same analysis could be used by leveraging a Gantt chart. So like I was saying, for retail foot traffic, if you're trying to emphasize particular times that are high or low, or if you wanted to look at, again, machine uptime or downtime, this is a good way to be able to show that data summarized here. And a lot of tools will combine some way to be able to do a Gantt chart, whether it's through bar charts, kind of highly customized, or actually with a Gantt chart option. But this one might be a little more accessible for people to understand what's going on too. The next one here is bullet charts. So these can be thought of as like more successful, accomplished cousins to the gauge charts that are popular in analytics tools today. But what I like about bullet charts is that you can actually define a target by the slider. You can show the actual value, by the slider with a target value, but then also provide supplementary information like quartiles, medians, or means to give context to the data. So not just did I miss my target, did I hit my target, but what was the expectation I had within my data as far as overperforming or underperforming the target. So Stephen Few loves these charts. He talks about this in his book, Information Dashboard Design, I believe, which we'll provide you at the end, the links for that. But these ones are better than just showing a straight gauge if your people really want to see like the car dashboard views of your data. And then the last two we're going to discuss here, again, this is from the same guy, Mike Bostic, on d3js.org. So the one on the left is a force-directed graph. So what this is visualizing, this example at least, is the co-occurrence of characters in a novel, so when they were in the same scene together, basically. But you can imagine visualizing, co-occurrence of products here in a market basket analysis, or how your customer relationships are with one another if there's commingling there. Again, not very precise, but this is going to give you a different view of your data potentially than visualizing with our standard deck of 12 visuals, because you're going to show more relationships here. The one on the right then with the dependency wheel is a very similar way of visualizing the data as the one on the left, but the twist here, which I like, is the width of the circle actually tells you the occurrences of codependencies. So you can see, for example, like I said, if I was talking about a market basket analysis of how many products occur together in the same transactions, the percentage of the circle that it takes up would show the co-occurrence as compared to the other products. So you can see which products show up more than others, as opposed to like just drawing lines and trying to somehow infer, like, does this have more lines than that? It can be really difficult. So this is, again, not very precise, but it adds another layer of connectedness to your data here. And again, it's going to require training possibly to avoid miscommunicating the information here. But they're really fun to look at. Most of the time they're interactive or they wiggle. And if someone gets value out of it, they're going to feel like they found a needle in a haystack, which is really exciting. And visualizing, like I said, visualizing information this way might lead to discoveries that you might not have appeared as obviously before. So it's good to think outside of the box occasionally. And again, I just like, these are visually appealing charts. Interactivity and color, while they're not particularly meaningful or strategic in these instances, they stand out to your audience. And if it's pleasant to look at, it's more likely to be paid attention to by your audience. So take advantage of it when it's appropriate. As a data visualizer and communicator, remember that it's your job to manage attention, though, appropriately between aesthetics and efficiency and clarity. Once you know the rules like pre-attentive attributes and the differences between your approach for exploratory, if you intentionally break them for the sake of adoption, as long as you don't misrepresent the information in your data. That's really important. So the balancing act is why data visualization is always going to be part art, part science, and part politics. But manage the tension, and you're going to bridge the gap between your data and your audience. So in closing, remind yourself of these principles and ask yourselves these questions before you share data visualizations with others. And we'll put these back up here in a second, but I just want to make sure to call this out as well. So these are great references. I hope that I've inspired you to go out and buy some of these books, because there's a wealth of information available to you with lots of examples and pretty pictures. So take advantage of them, and we'll make sure we send these out after the webinar as well, or make them available to you guys. So in closing, like I said, remind yourself of these principles and ask yourself these questions before you share data visualizations with others. So I'll kick it back to Tracy now and allow you guys, if you have any questions, feel free to post them, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible.
Cool. In the meantime, I don't see any questions coming in at this point. But thanks again, Tony. Thanks so much for presenting, and thanks everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us. So just a couple of closing remarks. As Tony mentioned, we will send out an email that does contain the link to the resources that Tony showed just a second ago. And we'll also send everyone, people had asked earlier about a link to the recording. So yes, we will be, and actually someone just asked about that again. So yeah, we will definitely send out a link to the recording in case you want to listen to it later or share it with anyone. Yeah, so with that, I guess I'll go ahead and conclude our webinar. Thanks again for joining, and hope that you all have a great day. Bye.